poet Hugo von Hofmannsthal lived and worked in his villa in Rodin, near Vienna. It was here, in close collaboration with the composer Richard Strauss, that the texts for Elektra and Rosenkavalier originated, two operas whose success was unmatched at the time. The Viennese Hofmannsthal was more than just a librettist for the Munich-born Strauss. He was also advisor, friend, and artistic mentor. In a romantic garden pavilion, sheltered from the sounds of family life, he also worked on the verses for Arabella. "I based them round a calm, peaceful ending," he wrote to his partner, "but I wasn't sure if they would please you. Therefore, when your letter arrived, I was greatly relieved." Strauss answered,
"First act superb. Many thanks and congratulations. Faithfully yours, Dr. Richard Strauss."
This telegram never reached the poet. He died on June the 7th, 1929. Hofmannsthal was buried in the Karlsburger cemetery near Vienna. The death of his so highly esteemed colleague marks the beginning of the last chapter of Strauss's life, a period characterized by conflict and contradictions.
Theirs was one of the most beautiful and productive chapters in the entire history of opera music. I can only compare it to Da Ponte Mozart and their Figaro, Don Giovanni, Così fan tutte. Well, I'm very familiar with their correspondence, their diaries. I learned a great deal from them. It's fascinating how they stimulated each other, inspired each other, sometimes with insults, but that didn't matter. Masterpieces were the result. Incredible masterpieces.
When Hofmannsthal died in 1929, Richard Strauss, aged 65, was the most successful composer of his time. With his early tone poems, he had both shocked and captivated the public. Strauss operas were performed around the world. He was a sought-after conductor, had served as court conductor under Wilhelm I and as director of the Vienna State Opera. In short, no other classical composer had ever looked back on so successful a career. Furthermore, Richard Strauss's well-developed materialistic instinct enabled him to turn artistic triumphs into wealth and good living. His villas in Vienna and Garmisch were sumptuously furnished in a grand upper-class style. There was none of the inspired chaos of Mozart, the neglectfulness of Beethoven, the ostentatiousness of Wagner. Bavarian order prevails here. Strauss drafts the main provisions of music copyright law and founds GEMA, the German Performing Rights Society. As an entrepreneur, he has both feet planted firmly in the 20th century. As a composer, however, he is a child of the Romantic movement, bound in thought and feeling to the world of the 19th century. In his study, he surrounds himself with memorabilia of the music greats: Beethoven, Mozart, Wagner, Verdi. He accepts the countless honors and decorations bestowed on him by those in power as natural and rightful homage to the superiority of the creative mind. In keeping with the tradition of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, Strauss feels responsible only to the demands of art, existing alongside of, but untouched by everyday realities. For him, art is religion. He remains a spoiled, carefree idealist, even with the advent of the Third Reich, with its Philistine technocratic materialism. When colleagues such as Bruno Walter Thomas Mann and Arturo Toscanini are banned, Strauss does not raise his voice in protest. His love for his great idol Wagner and for Bayreuth brings him in touch with Winifred, also with Hitler and Goebbels. He does not yet suspect how cynically the Nazis will exploit him for political ends. Finally, in 1944, he's ostracized, with party headquarters decreeing, "All personal contact with Dr. Strauss is forbidden, but performances of his work should remain unhindered." Signed, Martin Bormann. During this last period of his life, Strauss, the much celebrated composer, withdraws largely from public life and dedicates himself to his family and his outdated fantasies. In an effort to preserve the continuity of his work, in the teeth of political interference and war, he will make compromises with a regime that disparages culture. The last 16 years of his life destroy the legends surrounding this man who gave the world enduring art. At 81, he must witness the total destruction of all he has held to be of worth. The romantic exuberance of youth gives way to the resignation of an artist no longer able to understand the world around him. January the 30th, 1933. The National Socialist German Workers' Party under its leader Adolf Hitler assumes power in Germany. That night, Hitler and Hindenburg watch from a window as units of SS and SA parade before them. A new mood is on the march. Just as before, under the Kaiser and the Weimar Republic, Strauss allows himself to be courted by the new authorities. Hitler supposedly saw Rosenkavalier 6 times. Goebbels, the clever strategist, immediately exploits Strauss's international reputation. In November 1933, he appoints him president of the state music organization, the Reichsmusikkammer. Strauss accepts.
I would have accepted this troublesome post of honor from any government, but neither Kaiser Wilhelm nor Mr. Rathenau offered it to me. And so, as a pioneer for German art, I have been offering myself in the marketplace for the past 50 years.
Strauss offers suggestions for opera repertoire reform.
I would like to see the programs made up of 2/3 Austrian and German music.
Yet he does not show any real commitment to the idea.
Aphoristisch zugespitzt könnte man sagen, Richard Strauss war Reichsmusikkammer.
To put the matter in a nutshell, one could say that Richard Strauss was president of the Reichsmusikkammer in name only.
Musikverwaltungskammer des Dritten Reiches.
He never put his signature to the statutes of this Nazi state music organization because of the racial clause. He was accused at the time, and there are stacks of letters denouncing him, of not carrying out the duties of his office properly, of using it to further his own interests, and of considering it nothing more than an agreeable honorary post for himself.
In ihm nichts anderes als ein für ihn angenehmes Ehrenamt gesehen hat.
In Munich, a defamatory article appears, infused with the new mood of the time, accusing the novelist Thomas Mann of disparaging Wagner. Among the signatories are Pfitzner, Knappersbusch, Gulbranson, and Strauss. Thomas Mann leaves Germany. The conductor Toscanini reacts by refusing to conduct Parsifal in Bayreuth with Hitler in the audience. Strauss takes over. Reverentially, he poses in front of the home of Wagner. Bruno Walter, being a Jew, is also forced to emigrate. Strauss takes his place.
I did that as a favor to the orchestra. It has nothing to do with politics.
In 1934, 5 years after Arabella, there is a new Strauss opera, The Silent Woman. Again, the librettist is a well-known literary figure, Stefan Zweig. Strauss is very pleased with his work, noting enthusiastically of the draft text.
It is charming. True comic opera. Better suited to music than either Figaro or The Barber of Seville.
The first performance takes place in Dresden. It is announced that Hitler and Goebbels will attend. The fact that the Nazi racial laws also apply to Stefan Zweig never occurs to Strauss as a problem.
Dr. Goebbels is well disposed towards me. I'll discuss it frankly with him.
When they learn that Strauss has succeeded in getting the Jewish librettist's name included in the program, the Führer and his propaganda minister turn back in mid-flight. After 3 performances, The Silent Woman is taken off. A comedy has turned into a grotesque.
Only within himself can a person find relief from all the nonsense in the world.
Shocked and antagonized by the furor over The Silent Woman, the composer expresses anti-Nazi sentiments in a letter to Zweig, who is living in exile in London.
For me, there are only 2 categories of people, those with talent and those without.
The letter is intercepted by the Gestapo, and Strauss is forced to resign as president of the Reichsmusikkammer. He retreats contemptuously from public life and slips back into the role of the devoted family patriarch in Garmisch.
Ich würde ihn so beschreiben, war ein Mensch, der also in keinster Weise...
I would describe him like this. He was a person who did not in any way want to give the impression of being someone special. Neither in his manner, nor in the whole way he dressed, walked or moved.
Österreichisch gefärbten Münchner Dialekt.
He quite consciously spoke in a Munich dialect, with a touch of Austrian.
Hatte sehr viel Humor.
He had a great sense of humor.
War verschieden zu den verschiedenen
He treated different people differently, of course. But in private, even when one was alone with him in a professional capacity, he was incredibly open, easygoing and friendly. That made it easy for people to be themselves with him.
Strauss has no prima donna affectations. He's always approachable. In the midst of a lively gathering, he can write a full score.
I don't mind being surrounded by family or friends enjoying themselves. I can work anyway.
Familie war für ihn ein und alles. Also das war seine Arbeit.
For him, the family was everything. Well, first came his work, his artistic creation, but then his family.
Ja, also, ich möchte fast sagen, hat auch fast für seine Familie gearbeitet.
He worked for the family too, thought about the future.
Nach ihm.
About providing for them after he was gone, of how the family tradition would be carried on.
Zu leiten oder weiterzuführen, oder wie Sie es nennen wollen.
In 1936, the Reich fates itself. Strauss provides the music.
I escaped from pre-Christmas boredom by composing an Olympic hymn for the common masses. I, who hate and despise sports.
At the opening ceremony of the Berlin Olympic Games, the composer appears once again in public, before the assembled leaders of the Third Reich he conducts his hymn of praise to the Olympics.
Dazu ist zu sagen, dass der Auftrag nicht von der Regierung des Dritten Reiches kam.
It should be pointed out that the commission for the hymn did not come from the German government, but from the International Olympics Committee.
Nicht nur des Geldes wegen angenommen hat, sondern weil
Strauss most certainly did not undertake the assignment purely for the money, but because it also offered him an opportunity to repair the damage done in 1935 with the banning of The Silent Woman. He hoped this little gesture of compliant loyalty would regain for him the goodwill of the Third Reich, which he badly needed.
Musically, Strauss is not only one of the last Romanticists, he is also the type of artist who turns out one work after another, apparently without effort. In spite of his advanced age, he continues to work with the precision of the skilled craftsman, his sovereign creativity sustained by years of experience. His perfect ability to picture sounds enables him to compose in his head without the need for a piano.
Über seinen Schaffensprozess weiß niemand.
Nobody really knows about his creative process, not even his biographer, Dr. Schuh, who knew him better than anyone.
Die Eingebung kam und wie gearbeitet.
What inspired him, how he worked. All we know is that the melodies came to him in the spring and summer, and that in the autumn and winter he developed them.
Melodien dann im Herbst und Winter ausgearbeitet.
But exactly how his creative process worked, nobody knows.
Das weiß niemand. Und hat's auch.
He kept that hidden, even from my mother, who had a keen understanding and insight. He told her, I won't talk to any of you about it. You wouldn't understand anyhow.
Steht ihr ja sowieso nicht.
But his conducting was uncomplicated. It had a Spartan-like simplicity and clarity, great clarity. The orchestra followed him easily, aside from the fact that he commanded more than the usual amount of respect as a famous personality. The orchestra liked him, precisely because he was so clear and knew exactly what he wanted. He spoke very little. His eyes were the strongest element in his conducting. I can still see his eyes today. They were tremendously striking anyway, but particularly so when he was on the rostrum.
Da hat mir gesagt, ja, Sie fuchteln zu viel.
He told me, you wave your arms too much. You're too fond of the music. Let the audience enjoy it. You shouldn't so much. And then his wife, the famous Pauline, said, but Richard, you used to gesticulate so much you developed heart trouble. You say he gesticulates too much. When you were young, you gesticulated even more. Then he said, that's true.
For relaxation, Strauss turns to card playing, often all night, and mostly for high stakes.
War ein raffinierter Spieler. War, man kann ruhig sagen, ein frecher Spieler.
He was a clever player. One could say an impudent one. He made unbelievably audacious bids, such as would never occur to the average player. There was a lot of talk about his card playing, too much sometimes in my opinion. Once I had the courage to ask him, "Doctor, why are you so fond of cards?" He answered, "I'll tell you. For me, as a composer, everything is transformed into music. Ever since I began to breathe, think, everything I see, whatever I take in, I've seen and taken in as music. A person walking, nature, animals." And for a person my age, he was 80 at the time, this can become burdensome. First of all, I have already written down most of what I've heard, and this process of writing down becomes more difficult the older one becomes. So my seeing everything as music has sometimes been a nuisance to me.
Ever since his first trip to Greece in his youth, Strauss has been drawn to the south. Martin, the chauffeur, drives him to Italy. Strauss loves such car journeys. On these cultural trips, Strauss seeks relief from the low-brow banality of daily life, but above all from the political life that exists around him. He remains resentful of the regime.
It is a sad state of affairs when an artist of my standing has to ask a pipsqueak of a minister what he may be allowed to compose.
In Florence, Pisa, Siena, he finds that wealth of antique culture that to him represents lasting values. Antiquity and the neoclassicism of the Renaissance have a magical attraction for him.
From the moment when, arriving from Brindisi on the Italian steamer, I saw the blue Albanian mountains, I became a German Greek, and have remained one to this day.
As a connoisseur of the European classical heritage, he also attempts to adapt classical themes into his works, as in Daphne, Danae, and Ariadne on Naxos.
My Greek operas in particular have created symbols in sound that may be regarded as the final fulfillment of a yearning for the beauty of ancient Greece.
On one of the trips to Italy, in Rapallo in 1936, Strauss meets his friend and kindred spirit, Gerhard Hauptmann. Later, Hauptmann would write to Strauss, "The meetings with you are among my most cherished memories."
Humanismus, ein Drang zum Klassizismus,
This humanism, this devotion to classicism, Plato and Socrates, it all meant everything to him. For my father and us grandchildren, a humanistic education with Greek and Latin was predetermined, the sine qua non about which there could be absolutely no discussion in our house. And of course sometimes the demands made on us were very tough.
The music of Ariadne on Naxos, which stemmed from the Hoffmann-style period, is a prime example of what classicism meant to Strauss. Seeking the essence of simplicity, he strives for clear, balanced proportions. It is the same spirit that defines the architectural face of his native Munich. Like no other city, the Bavarian capital reflects this romantic longing for classical forms.
He had always been a romantic composer, and he had a tendency towards conservatism. He started out as a revolutionary. Talking about Elektra, he said, "I have already overstepped the boundaries of tonality." And from then on, he returned to tonality. There are two types of really great composers. Either they become totally conservative at the end of their lives, or totally revolutionary. Both are equally creative, are of equal merit. He became a conservative.
In 1936, Strauss composes his bucolic tragedy, Daphne, again finding inspiration in Greek mythology. Apollo pursues Daphne, but the chaste maiden will have nothing to do with him. As the god's urging becomes ever more insistent, Zeus changes her into a laurel tree. Strauss is particularly fond of this part of his opera. The librettist for Daphne, as well as for the opera Friedenstag, is the drama theorist Joseph Gregor. Strauss is often dissatisfied with the results.
Too much soul and feeling, too much poetry. That's not the way. No thoughts, no poetry. Action and characters. Drama.
Joseph Gregor war kein Wunschlibrettist von Richard Strauss.
Joseph Gregor was not Richard Strauss's choice as librettist. He had been put forward by Stefan Zweig after he emigrated. Working with Gregor, who was neither a poet nor a writer, Strauss had to dispense some of the literary demands he had always been able to make on Hofmannsthal and Zweig. Yet at first, Richard Strauss was aware of Stefan Zweig's continuing influence in Gregor's libretti. Zweig had conceived the scenarios. He even supervised the final texts. To such an extent, in fact, that eventually, in the final phase, Richard Strauss could no longer differentiate between their work.
The Vienna villa of the Strausses directly adjoined the Belvedere Palace Gardens. Here in Vienna, Strauss had been director of the court opera in the 20s. Now, in 1936, he returns with his family, which in Nazi terminology is Jewish tainted. His daughter-in-law Alice is Jewish, and both his grandchildren are half Jewish. Strauss hopes that in Austria his family will be assured of protection from persecution. The composer enjoys strolling in the park. He can enter Prince Eugene's gardens through a private door whenever he wishes. From these gardens he can see spread below him the city of great musicians. He likes to count himself among their number. In Germany, preparations for war are in full swing. But in Vienna's Jachengasse, life is untroubled. Pauline, Strauss's strong-willed wife, is often the center of festivities. There are parties with colleagues, including the conductor Eugene Pabst and the always jovial Hans Knappertsbusch. Strauss is apparently totally unaware of the imminent European catastrophe. He continues instead to pay homage to his religion, art, whose temples are the opera houses where Wagner's Tristan and Isolde is performed.
Tristan is the supreme consummation of the spirit of Schiller and Goethe, and the highest achievement of 2,000 years of theatrical evolution.
So beseitigte man Grenzen, mit denen die Hassapostel von Versailles glaubten, deutsche Volksgenossen vom Deutschen Reich trennen zu können.
With the invasion of Poland on September the 1st, 1939, the bloodiest chapter in German history begins. Hitler's Reich drops its aesthetic pretenses once and for all. While the slogan proclaims wheels must turn for victory, cultural life is noticeably curtailed. Since the Anschluss of Austria, even Vienna is no longer safe.
We were in constant fear after the Kristallnacht in 1938. Particularly my mother. She had to surrender her ID card. And we boys had to have special permission to attend school. In other words, we were tolerated, and naturally we felt it.
Strauss tries everything to save his daughter-in-law and the children. He accepts a commission from the Japanese government, which is allied to Germany, to compose a commemorative piece. In return, Japan is to intervene with Hitler to secure the protection of his family. The personal intervention of Vienna's district commander, Baldur von Schirach, saves Alice, but all her relatives die in concentration camps.
Grandpa was conducting in Dresden. Naively, he imagined that he could go to the camp to visit Mrs. Neumann, my great-grandmother, and possibly bring her home with him. So he drove to Theresienstadt with Martin and was stopped at the gates. There were some guards, and Grandpa said to them, "Look here, I'm Richard Strauss, and I want to visit Mrs. Neumann." Whereupon they just stared at him as though he were from another planet.
Völlig unverrichteter Dinge stand vor einem Tor und
And Grandpa, totally unsuccessful in his mission, of course, just stood there. He simply could not imagine such things were possible. It was beyond his comprehension.
Strauss escapes the shock of the present by looking backward in time. For example, the Rococo period serves him well in the unconventional opera Capriccio, a musical conversation piece. Joseph Gregor is originally to provide the libretto, but once again Strauss voices his disappointment.
Unfortunately, the draft you sent in no way complies with my wishes.
Strauss pretends to be writing the text himself, but actually commissions his friend, the conductor, Clemens Krauss.
I suppose Gregor will be very angry about this deception. But isn't a 75-year-old entitled to all the egotism of creativity?
In spite of the war, his opera, The Love of Danae, is scheduled to have its premiere in Salzburg in 1944.
Please convey my thanks to the minister for retaining Danae on the Salzburg program.
However, the production never goes beyond one ghost-like dress rehearsal. Danae, too, is a return to the Greek mythology which had inspired painters throughout the ages. Zeus loves Danae. In order to approach her without being recognized, he comes to her in a shower of gold.
After the Salzburg dress rehearsal, he said the famous lines, "We shall meet again in better times. This is the end of Western civilization." That was a strong statement to make at the time. Naturally, we felt we were probably meeting for the last time right then. You know, in those days, most of us were blind and deaf to whatever might come after us. We didn't waste any energy thinking about things like that. We were wrapped up in our work, let it absorb us completely.
By mid-1944, the Allied invasion is in full force. The opera houses in Vienna, Munich and Dresden are destroyed by bombs. Only now does Strauss realize the extent of the catastrophe. He writes in his diary,
Germany, 1945. Although the body may be dead, the spirit lives on. On March 12th, the magnificent Vienna Opera House fell prey to the bombs. But on May 1st, the worst period in the history of mankind came to an end. A 12-year reign of evil and ignorance, during which Germany's 2,000-year-old cultural heritage was ravaged, irreplaceable architecture and works of art destroyed, all by a band of rabble soldiers, criminals of the worst sort. The curse of technology.
Surrounded by total destruction, Strauss comes to the bitter conclusion that in the struggle, traditional culture has lost to barbarism. He becomes resigned.
My life work is ruined. German opera is done for. German music banned to hell. I feel as if I were buried alive.
With the sorrowful metamorphosis for string instruments, he reacted for the first time in his music to what was happening around him.
Es gibt für die Metamorphosen eine kompositorische...
In Metamorphosis, there is a compositional theme called Lament for Munich. It was developed from fragments that Richard Strauss jotted down while under the immediate influence of the effects of war. Specifically, the destruction of the National Theatre in Garmisch. It was only later that he incorporated this sketch into the music for a commission he had received from Switzerland. He then enriched the composition with excerpts from Goethe. The aging Goethe's maxims fit exactly his own situation at that time. To this lament, which was inspired by contemporary experience, he added timeless philosophical insights. You might call it a kind of philosophical confession.
Immediately after the defeat of Germany, the Allies set up the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. The remaining miserable leaders of the Third Reich are accused of crimes against peace and against humanity. For the first time in the history of law, a judicial attempt is made to fathom the unfathomable. In most cases, the court metes out sentences of death or life imprisonment. Baldur von Schirach's sentencing takes into account his interceding for the Strauss family. He receives 20 years in Spandau prison. In the wake of an article by Klaus Mann, Strauss too is called before a German investigative board. It was claimed that the composer had been dangerously close to the National Socialists. But with members of the American occupation forces who want to commandeer his house in Garmisch, Strauss has no trouble. He simply announces,
"I am Richard Strauss, the composer of Salome and Rosenkavalier."
As a celebrity, he continues to have privileges. When the charges against him are dropped, the 82-year-old Strauss and his wife are already in Switzerland. They have moved there not for political, but for purely economic reasons. Living in hotels, Strauss has all but stopped composing.
Hat damals an Gott und die Welt Briefe geschrieben, an Advokaten, an Rechtsanwälten.
In those days, he wrote letters constantly, to God and the world, to everybody, especially to lawyers. He had no money. His royalties were not available to him because America, as well as all the other foreign countries, had blocked them. And in Germany, everything was in ruins. During a visit to grandfather, my father seems to have gotten into an argument with him. My father said to him, "Dad, stop all this stupid letter writing. It doesn't get you anywhere. Sit down instead and compose some songs. Compose anything."
It
was rather a fraught situation. Grandpa really thought his letters could make a difference. 6 months later, my mother went to visit him in Montreux. Swiss visas were issued only once a year. And he handed her some primitively bound music. Here are the songs ordered by your husband. Your husband. In other words, his son. And that was the origin of the 4 last songs. I say yes with total conviction. That is my good fortune.
Some of the old optimism actually does come back into Strauss's life. When he's invited to London in 1947, Sir Thomas Beecham dedicates a music festival to the aged composer, which turns into a tremendous triumph. And Strauss's final return to the young Federal Republic of Germany in 1949 is almost as great a triumph.
Es war Juni 1949.
It was June 1949. I was in Munich. We were working on a new production of Rosenkavalier. It was my very first Rosenkavalier. Then we got word that the composer would attend the dress rehearsal and that he would be moving back to live in Garmisch once more. And that's how it was. He came to the dress rehearsal with his family, and my heart simply stopped beating. They shot some documentary film footage with him, I think before the 3rd act. He then conducted the end of the 2nd act of Rosenkavalier with a Bavarian state orchestra, his old orchestra, in the Prince Regenten Theater.
Und hat dann das Ende der 2. Akt Rosenkavalier dirigiert. Und ich habe ihn dorthin eingeführt.
I led him up to the rostrum, and he was particularly nice and charming to me and to the musicians.
Zu der Musiker auch. Und hat dann gesagt, ja.
Then he asked, "Where are the horns?"
Da.
I don't hear much anymore, and I don't see too well either. He started to conduct, and it was still unbelievably good. You can see it in the film, how he conducts with few gestures and utter clarity. That morning, I learned more about conducting than I had in all my previous experience.
Meine Herren, wir fahren an Ziffer 253.
his later years, Richard Strauss lived the life of a romantic, trapped in an alien age. His last compositions, considered the musical expression of dying German Romanticism, have a strange, sunset finality to them. The depth of his relationship with nature, the clear harmonies and absence of conflict in his works seem to belong to another age. With Richard Strauss's death on September the 8th, 1949, in Garmisch, an era of romantic music and romantic artistic ideals comes to an end. His works span a vast arc, reaching from the turn-of-the-century cultural idealism over the National Socialist period of dictatorship to the beginnings of post-war reconstruction. In a materialistic present that shuns individualism, loves blank surfaces and the fast life, Richard Strauss's music resounds, conjuring up echoes of a once magnificent, far distant past. Between that music and today's world lie all the tensions that have shaped our century.
Descubra el espectáculo de la imaginación en el Noticiario Cultural 9:30, conducido por Miriam Moscona y José Gordon. Al finalizar, la película Brighton Rock.